Thank you to the Dulwich Society for inviting me to give this talk tonight. As Sharon has explained, I'm a Victorianist and a biographer with a special interest in recovering lost women's histories. I'll offer you a couple this evening, but also the rise of the middle classes throughout the 19th century. So the histories of self-made men mostly, and their tortuous journey towards social acceptance and political legitimacy. West Norwood Cemetery, or the South Metropolitan Cemetery, as it was first called, gradually became known as the Millionaires' Cemetery, a reflection of the sheer number of self-made industrialists, inventors, traders, who accrued astonishing fortunes. And it's what they choose to do with their money that interests me, and to how they chose to be memorialized in death in order to signal their newfound social status, which I find endlessly fascinating. I will come back to this early image of the cemetery, but before I introduce this evening's talk properly, let me briefly show you an example of what I mean. So this is John Lawson Johnston, whose dates almost match those of Queen Victoria's reign, who was the inventor of Bovril. And it's a case in point. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his story and the fact that towards the end of his life, he settled at Kingswood House in West Dulwich, the house we now know as Bovril Castle, which certainly looks like an ancient aristocratic seat. And as in life, so in death. Johnson chose to be buried in a very prominent position, right in front of what was then the Dissenters' Chapel. It's now a post-war crematorium that you can just see in the background. It's a huge mausoleum in the neoclassical style with Ionic columns, an architectural style popularized back in the 18th century, but which continued in popularity throughout the 19th, and we have our fair share of such monuments at West Norwood. The white marble and mosaic floor have seen better days, but it doesn't take much for us to imagine its former splendor. The importance of this monument is in Johnson's refashioning his identity, for this immense mausoleum gives a very good impression of memorializing an old and socially distinguished family, which couldn't be further from the truth. Johnson started out in life working as an assistant in his uncle's butcher's shop, but he had an inquiring, inventive mind. Looking about him at the butchers, he was troubled by the amount of beef scraps they were throwing away, and he set about developing all kinds of beef products, starting with a beef glaze made from condensed beef stock that he marketed as Johnson's fluid beef. Not the best branding. And eventually the product we all now know as Bovril. Now, you can read Johnston's full history on the Dulwich Society website, but I mention him here because he is representative of the kind of prosperous middle-class Victorians buried in the cemetery, often men of lowly origins, who used their wealth to refashion their social identities, to dress up new money to look like old. And his life story is typical of the new breed of Victorian middle-class gentlemen, celebrated both in non-fiction books, like those written by Samuel Smiles in the 1850s and 60s, men who came from nothing, but just with energy and perseverance made their own fortunes. Potters like Wedgwood, engineers like Stevenson. Now, Samuel Smiles isn't a household name, but Charles Dickens is. And remember, this is the lesson learnt by David Copperfield and Pip in Great Expectations. You will be a far better man and a true gentleman if you battle with adversity and make your own fortune by sheer hard work. Now, the Dulwich Society and the Friends of West Norwood Cemetery have very kindly furnished me with lists of important Dulwich people to feature in this presentation. But there are simply far too many to cover in any meaningful way. I mean, many of them deserve a talk to themselves. So I've chosen the stories of individuals who interest me and also who I think we might think of as representative, because with Dulwich as our focus, we might expect education and art to figure largely, given its high concentration of private schools and, of course, its art gallery. Many of the individuals I feature have already been researched extensively. So what I want to do tonight is to complement that body of research by offering new perspectives on these individuals as I discuss the significance of their final resting place. It's also designed to whet your appetite because in addition to this talk, I'll be offering walking tours for the Dulwich Society on the 17th of May, when I'll be able to include many more important Dulwich histories. It's unsurprising that Dulwich is so well represented, given the location of the cemetery, straddling as it does West Dulwich and West Norwood, or Lower Norwood as it was then known. And as I'm sure you're aware, the link with West Dulwich is going to be strengthened still further this spring with the opening of the Hubbard Road Gate, just one of many projects supported by the National Heritage Lottery Fund. Here you can see the recent restoration of the original Gothic Revival gates by Brammer. Those at the cemetery entrance, that's the image on the left there, are painted a cinnamon colour, and those of the Hubbard Road Gate are painted green, which really brings out the Gothic arch there. And as you can see, they're very nearly ready for use. And the very first person to be buried in the cemetery in December 1837 was a Dulwich resident, Harriet Raincock, who will meet in a moment. But first, a very brief explanation of how the cemetery came about. So this is an 1850s map showing you the location of what became known as the Magnificent Seven cemeteries, all located in what was then outer London. The location of West Norwood Cemetery is the southernmost one on that map on the left there. And they were built in large green spaces to accommodate the city's growing population. Highgate is, of course, the most famous, but Kensal Green in West London was the first, opening in 1837, and we were the second, consecrated by the Bishop of Winchester in 1837. And we occupy 42 acres. This map gives the impression that their location was overseen by a guiding hand, forming a ring, as they do, around the capital, but each was started individually by a private company. And let's return to that opening image of the cemetery, which was executed in the early 1840s. The South Metropolitan Cemetery was designed by the architect Sir William Tite. He chose to be buried in the catacombs beneath the Anglican chapel. And the overarching style he chose for the cemetery was that of the Gothic Revival, with, as you can see here, picturesque tree-lined winding paths. And this sketch also, I don't know if you can make out just in the background there, you can see the two chapels, one Anglican and one for anybody who wasn't the Church of England, the Dissenters chapel. And here I can show you photographs of the two original Tudor Gothic chapels. The one on the left is the Anglican, and I've included this little photograph of the interior. Note the catafalque in the centre there, which housed the original hydraulic lift that would take coffins below to the catacombs. And the image on the right there is the Dissenters chapel for non-conformists such as Methodists, Baptists, Unitarians. And as it happens, many of our Victorian self-made millionaires are not of the established church. Now, unfortunately, both chapels are lost to us because of heavy bomb damage in the Second World War. But a modern crematorium, which is still in use, was erected on the site of the Dissenters' Chapel. But many of the cemetery's original Gothic revival features have survived, as we saw in the beautiful gates and railings and the entrance arch. But perhaps of more significance, many ordinary people, or perhaps not so ordinary, chose to be memorialized with medieval looking Gothic tombs, again making new money look like old. And because these cemeteries were run by commercial companies, you could choose to be memorialized exactly how you wished. The central photograph there of the Gothic spire is one of my favourites. It's of the banker William Gilbert that you'll see as soon as you enter the cemetery. We think it was designed by William Tite himself. So let us move on and meet our first candidate of the evening, Harriet Raincock, the very first person to be buried here in December 1837. And to put her death into context, Queen Victoria came to the throne in June 1837. Harriet died 6 months later on the 6th of December 1837, and the new cemetery was consecrated by the Bishop of Winchester the very next day. Harriet was buried here 5 days later in a 12-foot deep plot bought by her stockbroker brother for £3 and 3 shillings. And Harriet would now, as you can see here, the original gravestone is no more, but a memorial plaque has been installed to mark the spot, bearing only Harriet's name. And I hope you can just about manage to read her name there. And it's located maybe about a 5-minute walk into the cemetery. I've given you a wide shot on the right there in case you want to find it. If you can locate that bench, which is just to the east of the wildlife area at the front of the cemetery, and walk backwards, you will find her. Now, the men in the family were employed by the East India Company as administrators and sea captains. And from 1818, Harriet lived with her family at Beach House in Dulwich Village, just opposite the St Barnabas Village Hall, on a sizable estate with horses and hounds, a milk dairy, pigs and poultry. Now, there is no known portrait of Harriet, and little known of this moneyed, but let's face it, unremarkable unmarried woman who died at the age of 41. But we can at least imagine the kind of house she grew up in. Here is a contemporary interior scene. And the little image on the right is of the street where she actually died. The minor is near Aldergate, now long gone. Nor do we know what she died of, but she was moved to write her will 4 years before her death, due to, as she put it, having for long felt how indifferent my state of health is. But it's her will that offers an amazing insight into her character. It's an extraordinary document. It's framed as a letter from one woman to another, her stockbroker cousin George's wife Martha, who lived close by in Dulwich Village, which testifies to her ultra feminine modesty. And here I've given you an extract. So it begins, "My dear Martha, I could not bear the idea of making a regular will, but I'm sure you and your husband will act and distribute my little articles according to my wishes." And as it goes on, she keeps referring to her mite of money, my little money and possessions, my trifling requests. But her possessions are by no means trifling. Besides the money she leaves and her investments, She lists watches, rings, brooches, necklaces, earrings made of gold, silver, set with diamonds, garnets, and pearls. Intriguingly, her final instruction to Martha is to burn all her letters. Goodness knows why, but meaning that a slice of early Victorian social culture is lost to us. Now, I'd like to move on from Harriet, given that we've got no monument to look at, to the topic of education. And I want to start with Alfred James Carver, who was the headmaster of Dulwich College for about a quarter of a century. Interestingly, he was also the chair of the governors of James Allen's School for Girls. Now, being a churchman, which was a requisite for any headmaster of the time, incidentally, he was also made honorary canon of Rochester Cathedral. Carver chose to be buried slap bang outside the Anglican chapel at the cemetery. Now, as I mentioned, the chapel is no more because it was bombed during the war. So the scaffolding that you see behind you is simply there to protect the catacombs beneath. As you can see, it's quite an impressive memorial, topped with an angel pointing to heaven. Carver didn't die until 1909, but this spot was actually chosen for a baby son who died aged a year and a half back in 1865. So I would hazard a guess that the original gravestone was rather more modest, and that this monument was commissioned for Alfred and his wife Eliza, who died just a couple of years before him. We can see baby Montague's name on one of the side panels here. And there are many other children and grandchildren buried here. Now, Carver is also of interest to the Friends of West Norwood Cemetery because his wife Eliza was the daughter of William Peake, a very prominent tea merchant whose brother, here he is, whose brother James founded the Peake Freen Company that may be known to you, to whom we owe the invention of the custard cream, the Bourbon biscuit, and the Garibaldi. Carver's father-in-law, William Peake, was buried in the cemetery in 1870 in an impressive tomb on Ship Path. And he left upwards of £90,000. So presumably Eliza brought a small fortune to her marriage to Carver. And just one fascinating detail from Carver's own will, given that he was a churchman himself and his son Arthur Wellington Carver was also a clergyman. Carver left instructions that if any of his children or grandchildren entered a convent, a nunnery, or brotherhood, requiring an oath of celibacy or poverty, they would be disinherited. So he was determined to keep his fortune within the family. Now, I can add one more name to the list of Dulwich schoolmasters at West Norwood Cemetery, a name that might not be familiar to you, but I'm afraid I don't have his photograph, only that of his wife, Cissy. But here are his details. James Alfred Roper, who died in 1919, was a long-serving schoolmaster at Allane's School for some 46 years. He also supervised the football team. And during his time at Allane's, he lived at various addresses off Lordship Lane, finally settling in Frean Road, and was known affectionately as Doggy by the boys. Now, I only discovered Roper by sheer chance while I was researching the number of Dalton artists who are buried in the cemetery, because having been widowed for nearly 3 decades, in 1904, Roper made a late second marriage to one of the ceramic artists employed at Dalton's Lambeth Art Pottery, Cissy Small. So this is her portrait in the Lambeth archives. And the Ropers are buried together in Sissy's large family grave in Square 13, which is right at the northernmost end of the cemetery, where unfortunately many of the graves have not survived. Now, Carver, of course, is the most distinguished Dulwich educationalist buried at the cemetery. But the one that interests me most, and I think should interest us all, is Mary Jemima Alger. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, who was appointed the headmistress of the Dulwich High School for Girls on Thurlow Park Road, now part of the South Circular, back in 1878. Her grave plot that we can see here was bought by her brother, who was a Times correspondent working in Paris, for £10, and he would join her here. As you can see, it's a fairly modest, low-lying, polished pink granite tombstone high up on the cemetery, on a path lying parallel to the Eastern Road, taking you from the entrance right up to the northernmost end, which gives you, as you can see here, an amazing view of the cemetery. The spire that you can see in the background there is of St. Luke's Church. Now, the gravestone might be modest, but the funeral was anything but. The cortege included no less than 11 carriages. One was needed just to carry the surplus wreaths. There were 80 in all, and they couldn't fit them all on the coffin, which suggests the esteem in which she's held, but also her accomplishments, which are extraordinary. She became a school teacher out of necessity. Her father was a corn and seed merchant in Diss, Norfolk, and supervised the Sunday school at the local Methodist church there. But he died in 1842 when Mary Jemima was just 5. The church raised a subscription fund to support the family. But at the time, the only recourse for educated women without means was to teach, either in a school or as a private governess, think Jane Eyre. It was a poorly paid but respectable profession for women because it was seen as an extension of the maternal role. So Alger's mother, 2 of her sisters, and finally Alger herself all became school teachers. But for Alger, it wasn't just a means of making money. It was a vocation, one driven by the feminist principle of sexual equality, the idea, in her own words, that girls' education was not secondary to boys. And in time, she came to the notice of the feminist sisters Maria Gray and Emily Shiref, who campaigned for improved secondary education for girls and founded the Girls' Public Day School Trust in 1872. So the Dulwich High School for Girls was just one of their schools. Under Alger's leadership, which, as I say, it began in 1878 with just 47 girls. Within a few years, she'd expanded that to 400. And that's not the end of the story, because she then encouraged her very best pupils to go in for the entrance exams to Girton College, the first higher education college for girls at Cambridge. I've also included this image of Newnham College, which was founded a couple of years afterwards. Note their fashionable get-up. I mean, they are signalling that they are the equal of men, sporting their ties and waistcoats and jackets. Many of you will also be aware that Alger is noteworthy for organising a women's suffrage petition signed by all her teachers in 1884. That was the year that most working class men finally got the vote. She didn't call for all women to get the vote, but she made a special case for women householders, i.e. ratepayers, and to intelligent and educated women, such as headmistresses and teachers. But what fascinates me about Alger's story is what it reveals to us about the attitudes of Dulwich residents to girls' education in the 1880s, of wealthy parents who clearly wanted their daughters to receive the same education as their sons attending Dulwich College. So I was very surprised to realise that there was a strong relationship between Dulwich College and Alger School. We know that Carver was supportive and attended their prize givings. And the headmaster who succeeded Carver, Mr. Weldon, actually invited Alger to hold her school's prize giving at Dulwich College in 1885, boys from the sixth form acting as stewards. And he spoke warmly of himself and Miss Alger as twin brethren. Now, this is just months after she has submitted her women's suffrage petition, which suggests that the petition only enhanced her reputation locally. At any rate, it did her reputation no harm, which, as I say, wasn't what I was expecting. Now, from education, let's move on to art, our next major theme. And I want to, well, we do have a number of artists and designers, men and women, in the cemetery, but I want to start off with an art patron, a phenomenally wealthy businessman who used his wealth to build up a significant collection of British art. So not Henry Tate, who is also buried in the cemetery, but Elhanan Bicknell, so named after an American Baptist preacher. Bicknell made a staggering fortune as a ship-owning merchant dealing in the oil from sperm whales, prized for its brightness when used in lighting, and also crucially as a lubricant for machinery in newly industrialized Britain. You know, so sperm whales, think Moby Dick. But we're going to think about his significance as an art patron and art collector. Oh, sorry, stay there for a moment. So perhaps anticipating his death, Bicknell bought this plot with a brick vault beneath the elegant sarcophagus and plinth to contain the coffins of his very large family. And he would be buried here 3.5 years later in December 1861. I've offered you 2 images of the tomb itself to try and give you the best sense of its location. It is just around the corner of what is now the modern crematorium, what was originally the dissenters' chapel. And it's a sizable monument, but he hasn't chosen to be buried right at the front of the chapel. He's almost actually towards the back, which is very discreet, unlike Mr. Bovril, who is buried right at the front. Now, this burial plot has seen a lot of comings and goings, which takes some explaining. Firstly, it's interesting that Bicknell chose this spot because he'd already buried his 3rd wife, Lucinda. He had 4 wives in all and 14 children. He'd already buried his 3rd wife underneath in the catacombs. And after he died, the children had her exhumed and moved into this tomb. The other body to be moved is that of his close friend, the brilliant landscape artist, particularly of Egyptian landscapes, David Roberts. Roberts was originally one of the executors of Turner's estate. And very unusually, David Roberts, the artist, was buried in Bicknell's tomb. But then years later, he was exhumed, and he now lies next door. You can just see the stone marking his grave. So you can now understand why I wanted a wide shot to include both graves. Now, this is a portrait of Bicknell in later life, which, like the tomb, tells us a lot about this man. I love it. He looks utterly genial and at ease, but crucially, he has chosen to be represented not as a wealthy and busy man of business, rather as a leisured gentleman, even a gentleman scholar. I wish I could tell you what books he was reading, but note the fact that he's just casually holding his glasses as if we have interrupted him from his reading. It's fascinating. And Bicknell's art collecting is a key aspect of his attempts to refashion himself from a modern man of business to an old-style cultured gentleman. This is a picture of his very large and elegant Regency house, Carlton House on Herne Hill. And it was this house where he would hold artistic soirees that Bicknell started to collect all the big names in British art, Gainsborough, Landseer, and so on, suggesting a fairly conservative taste. But the remarkable departure from this is his interest in Turner, then seen as radical, not to say, completely baffling. Bicknell bought one of his first Turners in the late 1830s, just at the time the art critic John Ruskin was working on an essay on Turner that would be finally published in his series Modern Painters, launched in 1843. So did Bicknell know of Ruskin's admiration of Turner? Well, of course. They lived across the road from each other. And Ruskin was a frequent guest at the house, and so was David Roberts and Turner himself. The little sketch on the right here is of Turner at one of these gatherings at the Bicknell house. And if anyone is interested, I would recommend John Newman's book, Sunset over Herne Hill, which tells us more about their relationship. Now, by all accounts, Bicknell originally intended to give his collection to the nation, just as Tate would do. But instead, the family, those 14 children, sold most of the art to raise further money. And the sale at Christie's in April 1863 included countless works of art bought directly from Turner and Roberts, many of them actually commissioned by Bicknell in the first place. Now that sale raised some £80,000 at the time, which added to his whole estate of some £69 million in today's money. Incidentally, many of these paintings have ended up in the Wallace collection. Now for some more Dulwich connections. So Stephen Poyntz Denning has to be included, who was one of the first directors of the Dulwich Picture Gallery. Now, I can't show you a photograph of his grave because it's underneath these brambles. But if you walk a little further on the Dalton path that I've also featured here, and then take a sharp right turn into those brambles, he is somewhere there. And if you'd like to rectify this situation, please do think about joining the Friends Gardening Group, who meet on a Saturday morning. We're always happy to welcome new members. Denning is also a fascinating example of a self-made man. Born into poverty in Newington, Southwark, he was apprenticed to a print seller for 7 years, so learnt how to colour in prints with watercolours, but also the art of miniature painting. And it's, of course, his portrait of the future Queen Victoria as a child of 4 years old that is now in the gallery itself, that remains his most famous work of art. He was still a very young man when he was appointed head of the Dulwich Picture Gallery, which had only just opened in 1817, 7 years before the founding of the National Gallery. And he was required to teach drawing as well as look after the gallery, but he got a salary of 200 guineas a year, which must have been an extraordinary fortune to Denning. Now, again, Denning is much written about on the Dulwich Society website. So I'd like to turn quickly to a figure who may not be so familiar to you, and that is Alfred George Temple, who became the director of the brand new Guildhall Art Gallery, which opened in 1886 to allow the public access to the City of Art art collection. Now, he was born actually at the Guildhall because his father, his uncle, his grandfather all worked for the corporation as hall keepers of the Guildhall. But Alfred grew up in Dulwich on De Crespigny Park by the Maudsley Hospital, and he attended Denmark Hill Grammar School. And he is hugely significant because over the course of his directorship, he massively expanded their collection of art, largely, it seems, by just charming private art collectors into making donations for the edification of Londoners. Unlike Denning, Temple wasn't a distinguished artist in his own right. He certainly liked to describe himself as an artist in the early days, but his day job was a clerk working for the City of London. And his rise through the ranks of the corporation as various species of clerk was achingly slow. So I can only imagine that they gave him the job because he was solid and reliable and one of their own. Now, he chose to be memorialized with a very conventional, I mean, it is beautiful, but a fairly conventional stone cross, as you can see here. But there's no expression of his individuality. Crosses like these are 10 a penny at West Norwood Cemetery, and he clearly chose it from a stonemason's catalogue. The first person to be buried here was, again, an infant son. And after his son's death, Temple chose to live just outside the cemetery gates on Knight's Hill, not for sentimental reasons, but he knew this area well because various Temple relatives also settled in the area. In 1897, he was invited to become the first keeper of the new Tate Gallery, what we now know as Tate Britain, but he remained true to the Guildhall. And even when he tried to retire, they persuaded him to stay on for an honorarium of 100 guineas a year. He was eventually knighted in 1920, and he died at his home, 31 College Road in Dulwich Village, in January 1928. Now, just to conclude, I want to bring in a distinguished Dulwich artist, and that is Prout, who was a watercolorist to George IV and then to Queen Victoria, and is one of our greatest British watercolorists. He's buried over in the top right-hand side of the cemetery. Actually, I mean, you can't see them in this photograph, but very near those Hubbard Road gates that I was showing you earlier. And the National Portrait Gallery owns 3 portraits of Prout, including this one that was later bequeathed by Prout's son, Samuel Gillespie Prout, who was also a landscape artist, very much in his father's footsteps. Now, Prout's significance has been well documented on your own website, but I'd like to offer another perspective on Prout's story as a way of bringing this talk to a close, because as a young man, Prout was commissioned by the even younger John Britton, who's also buried in our cemetery, to provide architectural illustrations for one of the latter's studies, The Beauties of England and Wales. And they had much in common. Britton also being a self-made, indeed self-taught man. Now, here is John Britton's extraordinary memorial that you can't fail to notice as you first enter the cemetery. It's just there on the right of that beautiful Gothic memorial that we were looking at the start, which is in itself highly fitting, because we might say that John Britton, as illustrated by Prout, is one of the godfathers of the Victorian Gothic revival. Pugin Senior was another of his illustrators, documenting, as he did, Britain's architectural past, in particular our medieval Gothic cathedrals and ancient buildings. Now, Britain's tombstone is, of course, designed to look like a henge, as in Stonehenge, in Salisbury, because he wrote so much about the county. Why Britain is buried here, I can't tell you, but I strongly suspect it is due to the architect of the cemetery, Sir William Tite. In fact, there'd been an expectation at the time that he would, of course, be buried in Westminster Abbey. William Tite was also a leading voice in getting the Royal Institute of British Architects to subscribe to a second memorial to Britain in Salisbury Cathedral itself. But Britain's, we may say, proud significance reaches still further. We know that Britain wished there to be some kind of society that would act as a guardian of the nation's historic buildings, a dream not realised until William Morris's Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings in 1877, and then followed, of course, by the National Trust. But we might also include societies just like the Friends of West Norwood Cemetery, who are dedicated to recording, understanding, preserving, in our case, funerary architecture that defines us as a nation and to our people and our histories. Thank you.